And even though you may not be tested on it this year in AP World, this is a very reoccurring topic in a lot of the history APs. If you end up taking APUSH, you will definitely see the Cambodian genocide again during Nixon's presidency. You will definitely learn about the Rwandan genocide more in depth when you talk about the Clinton administration. And if you ever take AP Human Geography, you will definitely talk about human displacement. So these topics that I will talk about today will reoccur in other history APs that you take. So it doesn't mean that it's not going to be important, even though it's not tested on the 2020 version of the AP exam. So before we get into this, be sure to follow @ThinkVibable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And here's the brief outline of our stream. So we're going to do a brief contextualization, basic 20th century, what's going on, before we get into the 5 major events that we're doing in this stream. We have the Armenian Genocide, Holodomor, which also might be described as the massacre of Ukrainians by Soviets. It has 2 different names, and you can see the longer name is in the actual AP World packet that they made for 2020. The deportation of the Kalmyk, and then, as I mentioned before, the Cambodian and Rwandan genocides. So this is all 20th century. They're in chronological order based on year. So we'll start in like the 1910s, and then we end with the Rwandan genocide in the mid-90s. So just some brief contextualization. So as we head into the 20th century, we see a lot of changes occurring around the world in the form of new political ideologies. And essentially what a political ideology is a set of views on politics and the role of government. So in this case, our country's political ideology is capitalism. But you, as an AP World student, have experienced other political ideologies. You have studied other ones, such as anarchism, communism, conservatism, fascism. And today we're going to be focusing mainly on communism. That will go up and come up a lot. And you can definitely see this in our next vocab word. So one of the political ideologies that comes up before this time, but is more integrated during this time, more countries adopt it, is communism. And we have the creation of our first communist state, which the flag, if anyone knows what communist state that is, be sure to drop that in the chat. So yeah, the USSR. So the USSR was our first communist state, and eventually there are more, and we'll go over some more that adopt communism and some other forms of communism. We also have the beginning of nationalism. We see this a lot in the early 1910s to the late 1900s. It's another political ideology. It can be described as extreme patriotism. It's the act of loving your country and supporting your country to an extreme level. You support your country's interest, but you exclude those of other nations most of the time. So we can see this in the World War I era, and we're going to see this today with most of the examples that we're going over. We'll see some extreme nationalism. And then we also have militarism. And militarism is another political ideologies. All 3 of these are the major political ideologies that you'll be seeing today. So make sure to make note of that. Any of the bolded words are like vocabish words. They don't really have like definitions, so you can take notes as you wish on basic definitions or however you would like to take notes along with these streams. So militarism is another political ideology where a country believes that they should keep a strong military to be intimidating to other countries and to keep their power or gain power. So they believe militarist countries believe that they should use their military aggressively or appropriately to promote their national interests. So essentially, countries at this time are using militarism, are using their strong militaries to spread nationalism and promote their national interests. So essentially what you said, Tanya, nationalism is the extreme of patriotism, and countries want to spread this patriotism through the military. That's just a brief introduction. We'll go over all of those vocab words in more depth with their corresponding historical events. So Our first event is the Armenian Genocide, and the Armenian Genocide is from 1914 to 1923. So you may not have gotten to this in AP World before we were home, but if you know what major historical event started in 1914, you can drop that in the chat. And because the Armenian Genocide started in 1914, which is the same year another major event happened, we don't really hear about the Armenian Genocide as much as the other event that started in 1914. So the Armenian Genocide was the deportation, the genocide, the mass murder, and starvation of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottomans. So the Ottomans are the major group of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is a very strong empire. It lasted for many years. And the Ottoman Empire was a majority Muslim empire located in what is now modern-day Turkey and some other land that now belongs to other countries. And there was a minority group known as the Armenians. And the Armenians, most of them live in now what is Armenia. But there also is a visible Armenian minority in what is now Turkey. So they wanted to kill them, and essentially in a genocide. And if you don't know, a genocide is essentially the same thing as a mass murder. They're interchangeable words. So that event that happened in 1914 was the beginning of World War I. So World War I, also known as the Great War, kind of people saw it as more important and didn't really focus as much on the Armenian Genocide. So we're going to keep going with this. So it was perpetrated by the Ottoman government, specifically a group called the Committee of Union and Progress. That's some specific detail that you can mention in your notes, but it's not required that you memorize it. It's not something that you need to memorize for the exam, the Committee of Union and Progress. Just know that this was something caused by the government. As we mentioned before, it was the starvation of 1.5 million Armenians, and we can see this picture, this photograph of people who were affected by the Armenian Genocide. Most of it occurred in the Ottoman Empire, but eventually the Ottoman Empire became the Republic of Turkey in 1923. So it happened in both places because the nations changed over time. So why did the Armenian Genocide happen? So the Ottomans wanted the Armenians to conform to their culture, and they did this in 3 different ways. One of the ways was expressing something called Anti-Armenian Sentiment. And essentially sentiment is the same thing as prejudice. It's not seeing someone as the same level of you because of something. And the Turks at this time are mainly Muslim. And they speak a language that is written with a Latin script, like we do in English, with like letters A, B, and C. Now, the Armenians were Christian. The majority of them were Christian, and they wrote their letters and they wrote their script with a different script that wasn't Latin, not Cyrillic, but it almost looks like hooks. And they looked down upon the Armenians because of how different they were, and that caused them to persecute them. Another way that the Turks wanted the Armenians to assimilate into Turkish society, to like become part of Turkish society and get that culture and that language that the Turks had, the Armenians didn't, was through Turkification. And it's this way that the Turks would tell Armenians and go to them and be like, it's better if you follow our cultural and linguistic traditions. And they almost, because of their close proximity and their beliefs on it, they almost persuaded people to follow and become Turk-like, although they were ethnically Armenian. And our other thing that Armenians did to make, that the Ottomans did to make Armenians conform to Turkish culture was through Islamization. As I mentioned before, the Armenians are Christian and they write with a different alphabet. But it was mainly focused on the religion aspect. The Turks wanted the Armenians to shift their society and shift their cultural traditions to become practicing Muslims, and they wanted them to abide by Islamic law, So yes, Tanya, it is like coerced assimilation, but they did it through exhibiting these things and by murdering and starving people to get them to be Turkified or Islamified. And go to the next slide. So Holodomor is another starvation. This was something that was caused by the government. This was like the Armenian Genocide. It was caused by the government, and it wasn't something that was naturally going to happen. So it was caused by one of the Russian secret groups in the government once it was part of the Soviet Union. So this is before it becomes Russia. This is during the time of the Soviet Union, called the NKVD. And it was a Soviet-caused famine that led to the deaths of 3.5 million Ukrainians. Now, at this time, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union, but it is this separate part, and it's located more towards the western part of the Soviet Union. And during this time, the Ukrainians are experiencing nationalism. Now, not to like a level that's almost extreme, but they're very proud in their Ukrainian language, their beliefs, their culture, and the Soviets weren't liking that. They were more for cultural assimilation. So they caused a famine, essentially, and it led to the deaths of 3.5 million Ukrainians. So this occurred in the Soviet Union, as I mentioned before, in what is now present-day Ukraine. So there's the map. If anyone wants to have a guess at what country, what number it's labeled with, is modern-day Ukraine. So all of these nations that are labeled on the map were countries that were part of the Soviet Union but are now not, as the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. So there are many, many independent countries. The Soviet Union was extremely large. You said number 6. So number 6 is another country that had a major famine at this time. So there were many famines going on in the Soviet Union because of nationalism. So one of them occurred in country number 6, which is Kazakhstan. But Ukraine is number 14. It's like the light turquoise over there. So they are like geographically close. Like they're only separated by one separate part of Russia. But both of those nations had famines going on during this time in the 30s. So I'm going to keep going. So why did Holodomor happen? I briefly went over this. It was mainly because of nationalism, but the Soviets had to think of a way to get rid of nationalism in Ukraine. So they decided to do it by starving millions of people. But how did they get to starve millions of people? It's very difficult to get a country that is mainly built on agriculture and completely get rid of all the agricultural activity in a nation and get people to starve. So the Soviet Union did it through 3 main processes. So the first one is called collectivization. And if you ever studied the Soviet Union, or if you briefly went over communism before you left school, you would definitely have encountered collectivization. So essentially it is collecting food from farmers to an extent. It's more about collecting farms from farmers, but in that process, they did collect food from farmers. And we'll go over that with these first 2 vocab words, collectivization and gleaning. So collectivization is a communist belief where small farms should forfeit their land and give it to the government. And with this land, the government creates large, extremely large government-controlled farms. So the Soviets did this because they thought if peasants in smaller areas that have really small family farms could give up their land and give them to the government and create these massive, massive farms, it would improve their agricultural productivity. But collectivization was almost like a failure. It was an absolute failure because this system did not allow farmers to keep their crop. So what peasant farmers have been doing their entire life is they've been keeping some of the food that they produce to eat for themselves to avoid hunger. But this process, because everything was government owned, they couldn't keep some of their crop because technically their crop belonged to the government. So I don't know exactly. I haven't heard about burning crops and killing animals, but I have heard of other things that they have done. Like when we talk about gleaning and we talk about almost like what is a modern day dumpster diving, kind of historical dumpster diving. I've heard of that, but I haven't heard anything about burning crops and killing animals, but you might be right. I'm just not very familiar on the whole historical context of collectivization. So our next thing was gleaning, and they made gleaning absolutely illegal in Ukraine, and this affected peasants a lot because gleaning is the action of collecting leftover crops. So any crops that were already produced and they couldn't sell, or crops that were like too bad for market, but they could eat themselves, the peasants would collect them and use that to feed themselves. So they made this absolutely illegal, and this causes a lot of peasants to starve. It's almost like a modern day dumpster diving, and the way that the Soviets kind of said this is immoral and this should be illegal is because it promoted people to like sneak onto other farms and go onto other pasture and territory that belonged to other people and steal goods, which wasn't happening, but that was their way of criminalizing gleaning. And then our other word is Russification, and this is like what we saw with Turkification and Islamization. It's another form of cultural assimilation where they're trying to make a non-Russian group Russian-like. So the Ukrainians are another Slavic group like the Russians. They have similar cultural beliefs anyway, but there are some differences. The Ukrainians spoke Ukrainian, the Russians spoke Russian, and there were some other things that were like slightly culturally different. So the Russians wanted them to assimilate to Russian Soviet culture. And this was incredibly successful in the Ukraine, because the Ukraine now has two official languages, Ukrainian and Russian, but there are more people that speak Russian in Ukraine than Ukrainian. So even nowadays, it was a very successful Russification. So our next one is the deportation of the Kalmyk people. So this is also in Russia. This is a minority group in Russia. So Russia was split into little regions beyond what we saw before in the previous map, with like Russia, Ukraine. Those are modern day countries. We're talking now about little regions inside of those countries. So one of those regions in the Soviet Union was Kalmykia. Now Kalmykia was odd, almost because most of the people there were of Asian origin, and it was one of Russia's last territories that was located in Europe. So you know how Russia is so large that part of it is geographically located in Asia and the other part of it is located in Europe. So Kalmykia was technically located in Europe, but it was a Buddhist majority region. So that caused the Soviets to not like the Kalmyk people as much because their religion was different. While the Soviet Union empathized, but they wanted people to be atheist and follow atheism. Although the Soviet Union was very atheist, Russia also has a very religious history in Orthodox Christianity. So this was perpetrated by the Soviet government. Two societies called the NKVD and NKGB, also known as the KGB nowadays, but you don't really need to memorize this. They're just names. If you'd like to look them up and learn more about them, then you can go ahead. So what was the deportation of the Kalmyk? So it was the deportation of more than 93,000 people by the Soviets. And you might look at this and say, that doesn't seem that big. 93,000 people compared to what we saw before. We saw 3.5 million. We saw 1.5 million. So why are we learning about this when there's so many less people? But we are talking about the Armenian Genocide, which occurred over a period of 9 years, while the deportation of the Kalmyk was 3 days. And in 3 days, they were able to deport 93,000 people on cattle cars. So this occurred in the now region of Kalmykia in Russia, when it was then part of the Soviet Union. So that is the region highlighted in yellow. It's very small. I don't know if you can see it. It's at the end of the arrows. And what they did to people here was they rounded up anyone, Kalmyk men, Kalmyk women, Kalmyk children, and then any Russian woman, so an ethnically Russian Caucasian woman that was married to a Kalmyk man, they were placed onto cattle cars, and they were sent out to more remote areas of Siberia. So it's a complete transition to go from Kalmykia, which is technically located in Europe and has a slightly warmer climate because it's located in a less frigid region, to then be moved all the way to Siberia, which is known for having relentless winters and being cold, and especially having to do that being transported on a cattle car. So this was occurred during a span of 3 days in 1943, which is during World War II, which is also why people didn't really focus on this as much as they should have, because World War II was occurring at the same time. So why were the Kalmyk deported? So as I mentioned before, the Buddhism part definitely played a factor into it, as I mentioned before, but I also have 2 other reasons here other than Buddhism. So as I mentioned before, I mentioned Russification. So Russification, again, they wanted them to assimilate to Russian culture because they're a minority group that don't look like Russians. They have different features. They have darker hair. They speak a language that is not related to Russian whatsoever. They might be less uneducated. They might live pastoralist lifestyles, a lot of them still. So they wanted them to assimilate to the Russian life. They wanted them to live in sedentary places. They wanted them to speak the Russian language, and they wanted them to be overall Russian-like. And they also wanted cheap labor. So cheap labor was especially important for people that worked on gulags. So you might have heard about the gulags. So gulags are labor camps. So specifically, I'm going to get you something that's a little more in depth, but gulags are forced labor camps, and they were mostly located in Siberia or desolate regions of Russia that weren't heavily populated, were very rural. And they would house convicts here, all different types of convicts, everyone from petty thieves to murderers. But what gulags are known most for is for prisoning people who oppose the USSR's political system. So it mainly housed political prisoners. And because there were a lot of people that opposed the Soviet way of the Soviet government, didn't oppose communism, opposed the different leaders that they had at the time, they needed people to run these camps. So what they did was they essentially kidnapped this minority group and moved them to these gulags and said, you're going to work here now, and you're going to run these gulags. So gulags are a type of political repression, and we're going to see some other types of political repression, especially in the next example. Also, I'm seeing the comments right now. If you lose connection, usually your best bet is to reload. And if you don't reload, it could quite possibly just be me because of how bad the weather is outside right now. It could just be that. I like that you guys are having little notes in the chat, though. I think that's really nice. So they needed cheap labor for gulags, and then they also needed cheap labor for mines. So as Russia expanded into Siberia, they realized how rich they were in natural resources. They had coal, they had gold, they had oil, and they needed people to do this work. But it's also a very laborious process. It also can kill you quite possibly. And there weren't a lot of Russian people that were willing to do this. There were people that lived in more city-like areas of Russia on the European side, and they didn't want to do this job. So what they did was they kidnapped a minority group and they had them do it. So Stalinization is a type of Russification, but this specific type of Russification is Stalinization, because at this time, Russia's leader is Stalin. So you can also call it Stalinization. The period of de-Stalinization is after this. So after the Kalmyk are deported, So the Kalmyk are deported to very desolate regions of Siberia, and they stay here for until the 50s. Like, they were not able to go back to their region. They were not able to go back to Kalmykia, and they were stuck in this region until they were allowed by the government to move back home in the late 50s, early 60s. And this happened with many other groups in Russia. I just mentioned the Kalmyk because it was different because this one is mainly focused on Buddhism. There is also a different group that was moved during this time called the Chechen people. You might have learned them briefly. They had 2 civil wars in the 1990s, and I could have gone over it in Mass Atrocities, but there just isn't enough time. So they were deported because they were Muslim, and the Kalmyk were deported because they spoke a different language, and they're Buddhist, and they still live in the European part of Russia. So there's a lot of different minority groups that you can look up that this occurred to in Russia. It's not just the Kalmyk people. So this one is a bit of a longer one, just because it requires a bit of explaining, because everything that happens in the Cambodian genocide is completely against what we believe now, especially the Cambodian genocide, which honors people that have no education, honors people that live in rural areas. And we don't really see that as much. Here, nowadays, we look up to people who have an education, whereas in the Cambodian genocide, this did not happen. So that might need a little bit more of explanation. So is it true that China helped Pol Pot? And we're going to go over this in depth, but yes, Pol Pot was absolutely, Pol Pot is the leader of Cambodia during this time. So he was obsessed with Mao. So Mao Zedong died during this time. On the very beginning of the Cambodian genocide, he died. But he was absolutely loved his ideals and kind of looked up to Mao Zedong as a leader. So we're going to go over that, especially in the next slide, where we're going to go over the point of Maoism. So this was caused by the Khmer Rouge. So as you can probably guess from reading the name Khmer Rouge, France had a lot of influence in Cambodia. So France owned Cambodia during this time. A little before this, France had a lot of area in southern Asia, especially Vietnam, which you would have gone over if we weren't in this circumstance. The Vietnam War, and then we're going to get into the Cambodian genocide. So under Pol Pot, who is the leader of this at the time. So the Cambodian genocide was the genocide, a mass murder, deportation, and human experimentation of 1.5 million educated and middle upper class Cambodians. So this did not affect lower class Cambodians, people without educations, as much as it did educated and middle upper class. And the question is, why would you go for people that weren't educated? Why would you go for people that were uneducated because they couldn't contribute to society? And that is going to go in the next slide. So this occurred in what was then known as Democratic Kampuchea. Cambodia was known as Kampuchea for most of its history. It just recently turned to Cambodia. And by recently, I mean like 1980, but it's recent for AP World. And this occurred in the late 70s. So during the late 70s, people were more focused on what was going on in Vietnam, and they weren't paying as much attention to the Cambodian genocide. So this is a map of Cambodia. Just so you can see, it borders Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, a region that was just heavily affected by French colonialism and a lot of political instability during the 70s and 80s. So why did the Cambodian genocide happen? So the Khmer Rouge, which is the major group, wanted Cambodia to become a socialist agrarian republic. And that is a lot of words. So socialism is, we've seen socialism, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this stream, like the first 5 minutes, the type of political ideology. Now, agrarian is one of those words that you will see in AP World or AP Euro or AP Human a lot. It is a word that they love to put because a lot of people don't know what it is, and it looks kind of scary. But yeah, it has to do with agriculture. They wanted this country to revolve around agriculture because according to Pol Pot, That's what the Cambodian ancestors used to do. They farmed their land, and they weren't learning languages, learning French. They weren't learning how to do math and physics. They were just farming their entire lives. And what Pol Pot wanted to do is he wanted Cambodia to not Westernize, and he wanted them to go back to their ways. So if you ever studied Mao, you can see a lot of similarities, but you can also see a lot of contrasting ideas between him, and we'll go over that later when we get to Maoism. So first vocab word is classism. And this is something that we see a lot today. It is prejudice towards a certain social class. And as I mentioned before, classism nowadays is mainly focused on lower class people. But in Pol Pot's Cambodia, the lower class were seen as superior. They weren't as educated, and because they weren't educated and weren't taught certain things, they were less likely to speak up against his regime because of their illiteracy or because they weren't educated. Next is anti-intellectualism. So people in the middle and upper classes and people who are literate or have educations are looked down upon. And this is because, as I mentioned before, because of their education, they were more likely to speak up against Pol Pot, and he didn't want that to happen. Pol Pot believed that Cambodia was losing its roots as an agricultural-based nation because of education, and he wanted to reverse that. And now is Maoism, and Maoism was where we're going to spend a decent amount of time. So Maoism is a type of communism, specifically Chinese communism, that's going on during Mao Zedong's rule of China, which is until like the mid-70s, early to mid-70s. So Mao Zedong he was really fixated on the peasants. He was talking about how important the peasants were to Chinese society. And because he was so focused on the peasants, he believed that China should not China should not focus as much on the middle and upper classes, and they shouldn't focus as much on education. They should focus on the peasants who farm, mostly farm. And they should also participate in agricultural collectivization, which is what we mentioned before when we talked about the Soviet Union, that every farm should be owned by the government. So that's exactly what Mao Zedong did. Every farm in China was owned by the Chinese government. So Maoism caused two major events to happen. It caused the Cultural Revolution to happen and the Great Leap Forward. And his rule was incredibly unsuccessful. Maoism caused millions upon millions of deaths, almost like I would say anywhere between 10 and 15 million deaths. And this would have been a good one to mention in this presentation. So I put it with Cambodia because they kind of go along the most. During the Cultural Revolution, he wanted to preserve Chinese communism, and he wanted to do this by destroying old ideas, old habits, any old reminders of Chinese past, things like Chinese art or Chinese literature that reminded them of the past, because he wanted them to modernize, which is almost the exact opposite as almost the opposite of Pol Pot to an extent, but Pol Pot was definitely very influenced by Mao's beliefs. He wanted to get rid of old culture also as well during the Cultural Revolution. So the Great Leap Forward was something that is very similar to Pol Pot. They almost are exactly the same historically. So during the Great Leap Forward, Mao wanted the country to, as it says, leap forward. They wanted them to progress more. And Mao believed that he could get the country to progress. He could reconstruct the country from an agricultural economy, and he wanted to change it into a communist society. Now, what Pol Pot wanted to do was both of these, but that's not what Mao wanted. He wanted to turn the country from being farmer-owned and mostly farming-based to becoming a communist society where everything was owned by the government, and people couldn't have individual farms. And this caused a massive famine in China, and definitely all of the beliefs of Mao, everything that he did during his time as leader of China, affected Pol Pot's beliefs. So Maoism was second. Maoism is before this, or coincides for the most part. So Mao was leader of China in the 60s and 70s. He dies in 1973, 1975-ish period, somewhere around there. And during this time is the very, very beginning of the Cambodian genocide. So Pol Pot has like these 10 years of influence from Mao. And then right as he's starting the genocide, right as the genocide begins, Mao dies. So that's how that is on a timeline, just briefly on a timeline. So our last mass atrocity is the Rwandan genocide. And there's a very famous movie about this called Hotel Rwanda. If you've ever seen Hotel Rwanda, I watched it during my AP World class at the very end of school when we had nothing else to do and we were like done with the AP exam. We watched Hotel Rwanda, and it is a very, very good movie, and it clarifies everything in such like great historical depth that if you've ever watched this, you will definitely know all of this about Rwanda. So Rwanda is a small country in Africa. It was colonized by the Belgians during the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, I believe. So this is after independence from Belgium. So this was caused by the Rwandan government. So Rwanda has two major ethnic groups and then one that's a little smaller. So we have the Tutsi and we have the Hutu. And we also have the Twa, which I'll go over very briefly in the next slide, but mainly the Hutu and the Tutsi. So the Hutu had militias. Their names are listed there. I'm not really sure as to how to pronounce the names, so I'm not going to attempt how to say the names. So there are two militias that were Hutu-based. So the Hutu ethnic group were in charge of these militias, and also a group called the Rwandan Patriotic Front that we'll go over very briefly. So essentially what happened was the president was assassinated during this point. He was in an airplane and the airplane got shot down, and they didn't know who to blame. And the Hutu began blaming the Tutsi, and that led to a giant genocide and mass murder of 1 million Tutsi by the Hutu. Another reason that the Tutsi were blamed, other than the fact that the Hutu genuinely believed that they murdered the president, was that the Tutsi were definitely looked, the Tutsi were loved by the Belgians. And we will go over that briefly. And the Hutu were not as appreciated by the Belgians. The Belgians were not fans of the Hutu, but they did like the Tutsi. And we'll go over that very briefly afterwards. This occurs in Rwanda, which is located in Central Africa. If you know anything about African geography, it is located by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi, all countries that were colonial powers, whether they be Belgian or French or British. So definitely surrounded by other countries that have rich historical pasts during this time period. So why did the Rwandan genocide happen? So the Rwandan government and Hutus in the nation wanted the Tutsi to culturally assimilate. Another vocab word that we've kind of been talking about during this lesson without like strictly defining it. They wanted them to become Hutu. They wanted the Tutsi to abandon their cultural traditions and become Hutu-like. So the first way they did this was by having anti-Tutsi racism. So as I mentioned before, the Tutsi were seen as superior to Hutu and Twa by Belgian colonists because you can see in this picture, it might be a little small, but they were lighter in skin, they were taller, and they saw them as more civilized. And the reason why is because of the Twa people. So the Twa person is in the very front of this. I'll go to my slides and try my best, like right here, this guy. So the Twa are a group called pygmies. So what pygmies are hunter-gatherers. They still are hunter-gatherers, so foragers. They forage for their food. They don't have any type of agriculture. And they are also not taller than 5 feet. So because of this, they saw them as lesser than white man because they were shorter and because they were not exactly like European. They were the least European, although all of them were of African origin. So because of this, the Hutu and the Twa did not like the superiority associated with Tutsi. And then the other reason why is because of something called Hutu power, which is this belief that the Hutu are superior and they should have power. And they did this through something called the Hutu Ten Commandments. So what they did was they, like the 10 Commandments that we see in Christianity, but what they did was they wrote 10 reasons why the Hutu are superior and how a Hutu cannot be a traitor and support the Hutu cause. So this might be a bit confusing. It is a form of propaganda, but I decided to include them on the next slide. So just if you want to read them through, I will read them through right now. These are the exact Hutu 10 Commandments. There's 1 through 5 on this slide, and then 6 through 10. So I'm going to briefly read them, and then we have some review questions, and then I will answer the questions that you left below. I did not forget about those. So the Hutu 10 Commandments. So the first one was, every Hutu should know that the Tutsi woman, whoever she may be, is working for the Tutsi ethnic cause. In consequence, any Hutu is a traitor who acquires a Tutsi wife, acquires a Tutsi concubine, acquires a Tutsi secretary or protege. 2. Every Hutu must know that our Hutu daughters are more worthy and more conscious as women, as wives, and as mothers. Aren't they lovely, excellent secretaries and more honest? Hutu women, be vigilant and make sure that your husbands, brothers, and sons see reason. 4. All Hutus must know that all Tutsis are dishonest in business. Their only goal is ethnic superiority. We have learned this by experience from experience. In consequence, any Hutu is a traitor who forms a business alliance with a Tutsi, invests his own funds or public funds in a Tutsi enterprise, borrows money from or loans money to a Tutsi, grants favors to Tutsis, imports licenses, blank loans, land for construction, public markets. 5. Strategic positions such as politics, administration, economics, the military, and security must be restricted to the Hutu. And we can definitely see from all of these that it's very propaganda-like. It's very much a document that's trying to show ethnic superiority. It does sound like a bunch of rumors. It is essentially a bunch of rumors and stereotypes that they created because they didn't like how the Belgians treated them, and they believed that the president was shot down. And to this day, they still don't know who killed the president. But I'm going to go over them. The last 4, or I guess it's technically 5. We're going to go over the last 5, and then I left 3 questions, and then I will answer your questions as you answer the questions that I left there. 6, a Hutu majority must prevail throughout the educational system, pupils, scholars, teachers. 7, the Rwandan army must be exclusively Hutu. The War of October 1990 has taught us that. No soldier may marry a Tutsi woman. 8. Hutu must stop taking pity on the Tutsi. 9. Hutu, wherever they must stand united, in solidarity and concerned with the fate of their Hutu brothers. Hutu within and without Rwanda must constantly search for friends and allies to the Hutu cause. We see that through Hutu power, beginning with their Bantu brothers. Hutu must constantly counter Tutsi propaganda. Hutu must stand firm and vigilant against their common enemy, the Tutsi. 10. The social revolution of 1959, the referendum of 1961, and the Hutu ideology must be taught to Hutu of every age. Every Hutu must spread the word wherever he goes. Any Hutu who persecutes his brother Hutu for spreading and teaching this ideology is a traitor. So it does sound like a bunch of rumors. And if you have watched Rwanda, like Tanya said, the main character is a Hutu and he's married to a Tutsi wife. So that's, and he owns an upscale hotel. And that what they do, I don't think he owns it. I think he might own an upscale hotel. And they basically keep people who are going to be persecuted or anyone that's visiting Rwanda, because Rwanda at this time is a vacation spot for wealthy Europeans. And what he does is he keeps them safe in there while people are being killed around. So it's a very good movie if you want to watch it. But I have 3 questions here, some questions for thought. If you would like to go into the chat and answer them, I will give you direct my direct opinions on how they are, what you can do to improve your writing. Even though there won't be SAQs on this exam, I still think it's important to practice our writing, even though they might not be the same format. And while you answer these questions for thought, I'm going to go over the ask a question, things that you have left me. Juliana's question is, how do we know we wrote a contextualization that will be enough for us to get to the point? Now, I usually do my contextualization first. That's the first thing I will always do when I did DBQs, will be contextualization. As long as you believe that you have connected an event to something else and given it doesn't even need to be long. Contextualization should just be a brief historical background. It could be historical background, or you can relate something that's happening that is mentioned in DBQ to something else that is very similar. And as long as it's in depth and it shows some amount of historical knowledge, I believe that that's enough to get the point. The contextualization part should be very brief, and it doesn't need to be absolutely in detail to get the point, but it does have to show that you understand the historical background behind it. So another one from Juliana, we have, is it better to write a thesis with an argument, like the opposite side in it, or should we stick to writing it with just 3 topics that we will talk about in our body paragraphs? So again, like contextualization, my first paragraph will always be contextualization and thesis. Thesis will go very last, and then if I have time, I'll write a conclusion paragraph, and I'll repeat it at the very end. So is it better to write a thesis with an argument? Your thesis should have an argument. That's the point of a DBQ, is that you are arguing your point. So if you had a DBQ, if your DBQ was about the Rwandan Genocide and it was asking you to read all these documents, and it asked a question and support it with documents, that is your argument. You are either supporting your argument, whether or not you agree the question or not. So your thesis originally should have an argument in it. You don't need to talk about the opposing side, or you can talk about how the documents differ in opinion, how this one looks at this document about the Rwandan Genocide might be looking at it from a Hutu perspective, and this one might be looking at it from a Tutsi perspective. The Tutsi perspective is going to see it as more of something that's something that's terrible, and then the Hutu perspective is going to be looking at it as something that's righteous. So you can talk about opposing sides in your thesis. If you're going to do that, then you should definitely, in your body paragraphs, separate them with your different perspectives. It doesn't need to be 3, it could be 2. Sometimes I did 2, sometimes I did 3, really just depending on the documents. Do you mean a counter argument or your answer to the prompt? Your answer to the prompt can have an opposing side, like your thesis can have the opposite side to the argument. So usually the documents will have 2 different perspectives on things, and those are already countering opinions. So in your thesis, you can include your countering opinions, your opposite side of arguments. That's not necessarily a counter argument. Like, the documents do counter one another, but it's not your counter argument. It's you expressing the other people's counter argument, which you can mention in your thesis, and then you can briefly mention that in your 3 topics. And then the last, we have 2 more. What was your best study tool to be able to get a 5 on the exam? Mainly that would help you in DBQ and history content. So I did not like the DBQ. It was my least favorite type of writing. I was completely multiple choice. I was very good at multiple choice. So at this exam, I probably would not have gotten a 5. But I did do well on my DBQs, and the reason why I think was because of prep books. Now, it might be kind of hard to get a prep book because of just the current situation that we're in. So I think your next best bet would be to just go on the College Board website, and you're already on Fiveable. Like, I used Fiveable to study for the AP exam a lot. Like, I would do trivia, I would do questions. My history teacher actually used it in her classroom really regularly. So you could definitely take advantage of all the great free resources that Fiveable gives you. And if you can somehow get a book on Amazon, I'd seen that the deliveries are kind of like a month, and I don't think that they would get here in time for the AP exam. But if not, I would just use College Board resources that you might have on AP Classroom, or any documents that might be on there. I think those are your best bet, but you could always use Fiveable, and Fiveable is always going to be there for you. Do you have any tips or tricks which you used on your DBQ? Trying to think. I would always write a conclusion paragraph, and they don't grade conclusion paragraphs. You don't need a conclusion paragraph to do well in a DBQ. I always did it because it made my writing sound more finished. Almost, that doesn't sound quite right, but it made it sound like I knew what I was talking about. I felt like if I was able to write a conclusion paragraph, then I did something well, like I timed it well. And I thought that it made my DBQ sound better if I had a conclusion and I briefly went over everything, and if I briefly went over the opinions of every source, just to make sure that I got everything down and there's no way that I can like miss a point, because I basically summarized every single document in the conclusion. So I guess you could call that a tip or a trick. I'm trying to think about what I did. I would always use all of the documents unless there was one that I did not know. Like this AP, when I took the AP exam 2019, because I took it 2019, I was fine with all the documents. I always like when they have like an art document and other types of documents that weren't just writing. So I used all of them. But I remember in class, like there were sometimes like documents I just did not understand and I could not find a way to fit them. So I think a tip is to use every single document, because if your opinion is incorrect about one of them, then you won't get the full point. But if you do it for all of them and you know that one that you skipped because you thought you didn't have time is actually correct, you will get the points. I guess you could call that a trick. I think that's just like adequate planning. That's also based on time, because I know that your DBQ is 5 documents. It's much shorter, I believe, 45 minutes. So it might be harder, but you have to test yourself, time yourself. If you have a Princeton Review book right now, if you have a book with practice DBQs in it, I would go to a random number generator, put the number of documents that they have, and then it would be like, oh, choose 5 numbers randomly, and you eliminate the other ones that I didn't pick. So you would just be left with 5 documents. And I would do that to practice 5 document DBQs, because we've never seen this before. But definitely those would be my 2 tips, although they really aren't tips. So Tanya, if anyone else has answers, then feel free to put them in the chat. I will grade them really quick and see how they are. So Holodomor was an example of a mass atrocity committed by the USSR because of their desire for the cultural assimilation of the Ukrainians. This caused the death of over 1 million Ukrainians as they were starved by the Soviets. Yeah, so that's a correct answer. I definitely think you could expand on it, because it is an explain your answer, and you generally, when you see something that says explain, you want to like give specifics, and it is definitely like a good response. Like you understand the topic, but I would just look for a little bit more content. You can go down Holodomor. I feel like almost all of the events that we went over, you could go over all of these events in mass atrocity, because the majority of these events were because of a group's desire for cultural assimilation. Except for, I guess, Cambodian Genocide, except for, I didn't go over this, but if you'd like to know, the Cambodian Genocide also was against minorities as well. What Pol Pot wanted to do was he also wanted to eliminate Christians and Thai people and Vietnamese people that lived in Cambodia. So if you knew that, you could definitely use that as a cultural assimilation of a minority group in Cambodia. But you could definitely use all of these events. And I know that these are like really strict on timing, because it's like you were doing it while I was speaking, but it's really fine. It's not like it's the actual AP exam. So if anyone did B, explain the influence of Maoism on the actions of Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge during the Cambodian Genocide. So Maoism really influenced Pol Pot to do what he did, essentially. As I mentioned before, we went over the Cambodian Genocide. And then if anyone did C, explain the purpose of propaganda. Propaganda is to get people to believe a certain way. And it played a role in the Rwandan Genocide because it convinced Hutu people that they were superior to the Tutsi and the Twa. So that is the hour time. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask now before I leave, or if they want to like quickly put one of their essays in the chat, they want to ask questions. If there's 2 people left here, so you can ask whatever you'd like. You can put whatever you'd like in the chat. But if not, I'm going to end the stream. So I'm going to wait like a minute for anyone else to put something quick in the chat. And if not, then we can call the end of this. Oh, thank you. No, it's really, it's something to do during coronavirus break. But this is a topic that I really liked for the AP exam. It's something that I thought was interesting because it's nothing that we really learned because other events were seen as more important during this time. And even though you're definitely not going to be tested on this, it's something interesting and something that you will definitely see, even if you take government, if you take CompGov or APUSH or AP Human, you will go over all of this stuff again. Especially CompGov. If you ever do CompGov, you're going to go over the whole Cambodian genocide in China all over again, all of Chinese political history. APUSH, for sure. Be nice for APUSH, which I'm worried about. Yeah, I will be taking APUSH next year because I'll be a junior next year, and that's what my school does. I think just me knowing about this will help me for APUSH too, because these are kind of modern presidencies. These are really modern events. And this was like Clinton was Rwandan genocide. So I already know like a decent background on the Clinton administration because of this. And the Cambodian was Nixon, I believe. And then AP Euro. Yeah, I'm taking AP Euro this year. And it seems like most schools do AP Human before AP World. My school doesn't let freshmen take human geography, which I always thought was weird because most schools do human geography before world history. But I took world history as a freshman, and that's how my school worked. It's usually AP World as a freshman, and it's whoever gets a B in 8th grade civics. So I had 37 people in my AP World class, and then AP World, and then this year I'm taking Honors US. It's like all of the stuff we're going to study in APUSH, but like briefly. It's nothing but like the detail that you're going to see in APUSH. I have a lot of friends that are taking APUSH though now, and I've heard a lot about that class, so I am getting ready for it. Hutu Commandments for C, right? This was super helpful. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I read your other comments after the Hutu Commandments. So for C, I would talk about the Hutu 10 Commandments. You could talk about, yeah, that's all I could mention. All you could do is Hutu 10 Commandments for that. As I mentioned before. So if you guys want to continue, if you have any other questions, anything you want to mention briefly, any questions, anything about AP World or any other courses that you take AP that I might have taken, I don't really know. I only stream for AP World. Okay, so I'm only a sophomore, so I haven't taken that many APs, to be completely honest. I took AP World as a freshman, and I took AP Music Theory as a freshman. I definitely loved AP Music Theory, but I don't think I would recommend AP Music Theory if you don't have a classical background in music, because it's AP Music Theory is graded on, I think, 18th century music, and you need a good classical background. But if you have a musical background, that's definitely a class I would recommend. And then this year I'm taking Seminar, AP Seminar. which I'd recommend, but that's also because I like writing. If you don't like writing, it's probably not the class for you. It's part of the capstone diploma, so a lot of schools have it, a lot of schools don't have it. It's not something that you see in every single high school, the capstone program. And then I take AP Euro, but AP Euro is a self-study of mine, and I just did it because it coincides so much with AP World. Like if you take AP World and you want to self-study for an AP exam, if you wish to do that, you can definitely take AP Euro. And then I'm taking AP Art History, which is, I would say, the content that you learn in AP World is like 85% of AP Art History. It is so much overlaps, and there isn't that much like art terminology for you to memorize, but you have to learn the historical background of everything. And it's been a nice way to like refresh on AP World. So have you taken the AP Math yet? No, I'm taking AP Statistics next year. I just did my schedule like 2 weeks ago. So I will be taking AP Statistics. If I end up passing AP Euro or AP Art History and end up doing streams for those next year, I will definitely tell you for sure if I am doing well in AP Stat. But I'm definitely more of a humanities person. Like, I do very well in humanities. Math is not my strong suit, but science is like my strongish suit, just not bio. I do not like bio. I've never been the strongest in bio. And even though I will probably have to take AP bio at some point just because of like how my school is structured, I'm not a bio person. I'm more of a humanities, not bio, humanities and chemistry. That's pretty much it. So that seems like it's it. It seems like we're just talking about random AP courses, but level 7 in piano theory. So I used to be a competitive piano player, so that's where I got my my background in piano and French horn and trumpet. So that's where I kind of got my background for music theory. And I do like chemistry. I probably will take AP Chem, but my school doesn't offer it at the moment. So seems like that's it. I am going to head out. I will leave questions. Eventually, questions will be on the Fiveable website, and you can answer those questions, and they coincide perfectly with this. And I will also attach the slides as resources on the Fiveable website. So if you want to go back and maybe look through the questions again, or if you want to answer the questions, do as you please. Feel free to do that. They're available for you. I will also put tabs on individual minutes. So where you want to go, if you want to rewatch the Cambodian Genocide or rewatch the Armenian Genocide, I will put that on the Fiveable website eventually. Until then, I hope to see you at another AP World event. I'll be doing the Cold War, I believe, next week. So if you want to go to the Cold War, feel free to do that. But I will be doing it with a fellow streamer of mine named Jed. Until then, bye guys. It was really great to see you and to learn about AP World. I wish you all the luck, the best of luck on the AP exam. And I hope all of you guys are doing okay, especially in the circumstance. And I hope to see you at other streams.